Okay, right, awesome. Thanks, Andy. Okay, so good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Sarah Husky with 3C Ren. I've started this recording and it will be posted on 3C Ren's on-demand page. We are here today to talk about the 2022 CALGreen codes, but before we get into that, I just have a few slides to run through. So we just ask that everyone make sure they're on mute throughout the course. We encourage you to participate and ask questions through the chat box. And if you'd like to verbally participate, please raise your hand and we will call on you to unmute yourself. We will also have time at the end for some Q&A. We also ask that you please make sure your full name is displayed. We need this information for checking off attendance and for confirming learning units. So a few words about who we are. I'm with the Tri-County Regional Energy Network, also known as 3C Ren. We are a collaborative partnership between San Luis Obispo, Santa Barbara, and Ventura counties, working to improve energy efficiency in our region by offering free programs and services for building professionals and households. 3C Ren is funded by ratepayer dollars, which are collected through the public goods charge found on our utility bills. And the benefit of being ratepayer funded is that there's no cost to those we serve, and we are able to return these dollars back to our local economy, which has historically missed out on some of these funds. 3C Ren currently offers 3 programs. So the first program is the Energy Code Connect, which serves building professionals by offering Title 24 support for everyone from plans examiners and inspectors to architects and contractors. Within the Energy Code Connect program, we have our Energy Code Coach service, which is an over-the-phone, online, and in-the-field support for Title 24 related questions for both residential and non-res. We also offer trainings and support, which is this training that you're in right now. It's online courses for overall energy code comprehension, compliance, and enforcement. So another program we have is our building performance training, which serves building professionals such as architects, engineers, contractors, and real estate professionals by offering technical and soft skill trainings related to building science principles, high performance buildings, marketing, and communication techniques. And our third program is our home energy savings, which incentivizes contractors and helps residents save money and make their homes healthier and energy efficient with energy efficient upgrades through incentives and rebates. And you may see a few 3C Ren staff members on the training today. If you see anyone with this background, feel free to chat with them directly if you have any questions. And with that, I'll pass things over to Andy.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. I'm Andy Pease. I'm an architect and lead accredited professional here at Imbalance Green Consulting. I'll be the main presenter today, along with Soham Patel, another staff member at our office. So our learning objectives for today are, we're focusing on CALGreen, the compliance for residential and non-residential, and we'll highlight changes that occurred in the 2022 code. Not super significant, but there are definitely several woven through. We'll look at the mandatory measures and focusing on the benefits, like why are we doing this and what are strategies for implementation. We'll check in briefly toward the end about the tier 1, tier 2 and how those are used. And we'll be going through talking about kind of best practices for success in terms of building permit review and compliance. The intent of CALGreen is a baseline for the building code that raises the bar for the state, but remains feasible to builders. So we're trying to make sure that everybody gets to this baseline level, and then if a jurisdiction or individuals want to go higher, then these optional tiers. But like I say, today we're really going to focus on the mandatory measures to make sure that we're all in compliance with that. And there's been an evolution as we've progressed. So we started with Title 24, in addition to regular building codes, Title 24 Energy Code in the 1970s. In the late 90s, early 2000, we end up with the U.S. Green Building Council and Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design. And then in 2009, CALGreen came along. So state of California, wisely from my perspective, started with using the structure of LEED to inform what direction California would go. So same categories, some of the same overlap. And so that's how our firm really became invested in CALGreen, is because we were already doing LEED certification. So there was a natural progression there. And of course, now here we are in the current code, and we're really looking to have better buildings, and so that we have happier clients, happier communities, and we're meeting these compliance goals. So the highlights for those of you who are just, you live and breathe CALGreen and you're really just here for the 2022 update. They're not a whole lot. As I mentioned, EV parking is definitely the most significant. There's a little bit within the plumbing water section, some VOC requirements for low emitting, even a little bit of a scope change of parking lots and a few others scattered here and there. And so we'll highlight those as we go. But otherwise, we're really going through the whole code, making sure that if you have any questions along the way, a bit of a refresher on the code overall. So as a reminder, we're talking all of Title 24, and the section that we're looking at today is the Part 11. Often we talk about Title 24 as the energy code, but of course, any of you folks who are plans examiners, building officials, probably frustrates you. But we do want to make sure not to be confused with Part 6, the energy code. There's of course some overlap, so they reference each other, and there's a certain complementary nature to them. Also, in terms of reading the code, you just make sure that we're careful about who the adopting agencies are. Housing and Community Development for California, they're the ones that are in charge of the residential section. The Building Standards Commission is taking care of the non-residential, and then you have the Division of the State Architect for schools, state buildings, OSHPD for hospitals, nursing facilities. And so you'll see there's always an adoption matrix at the beginning of each section, and then you'll see in parentheses as we go through, there's some other specific ones. So the chapters of CALGreen, the first, administration definitions, we'll touch briefly on the building scope, because that does make a difference about what triggers CALGreen. But the main sections are really Chapter 4 for the residential mandatory measures and Chapter 5 for non-residential. Then it goes through and has some 3 chapters of reference and resource. Then appendices A4, A5, those are those tiers. So they're kind of tucked in the back of the book. But they're a pretty important section as well. So in terms of the scope, for residential projects, it's all new construction, and then it's alterations and additions that add area or volume. And so for those parts, you're just using the CALGreen for the new construction part of it, for alterations and additions. So you don't have to go back and retrofit unless it's something that's triggered by a different code. The plumbing fixtures in particular would trigger a retrofit. In the non-res, again, new construction, additions over 1,000 square feet, alterations that have a permit valuation over $200,000. And now there's also a parking lot alteration addition that will trigger some EV charging changes there. So that's a new about the parking lots. Mixed occupancies, you need to comply with whichever one is applicable. So you watch out for hotels, mid-rise, high-rise housing. Those times, often if you end up with a ground floor retail and then housing above, then you need to do actually compliance with both residential and CALGreen. If it's just a residential building that has its own community room, that's part of residential construction. That wouldn't trigger a non-res, but a specific set use for a commercial building would. So just make sure you're doing both. And then if it's a phased project, again, whichever phase, it's probably mostly self-explanatory. Whatever is being done in that phase needs to be compliant. but there's a little bit of coordination. Commissioning is one that requires coordination between phases, but also you can't go in with a TI and then find out that the site work wasn't completed for, bike parking or something like that. So if there is phased projects, make sure that you end up with a complete CALGreen compliance at the end. And then just, I didn't mention yet, but we will be providing a PDF of the entire slide deck. So you don't have to take copious notes. You can just know that this information will come to you. And it's easy to and free to access the codes online. There's also some helpful guides that provide some additional examples, etc. So feel free to reach out to those. Also, if you have questions along the way, you can type them in the chat, and Sarah and Soham will be helping to monitor that. Or, we're not a huge group. There's 25 on the line. So if it's really pressing, everybody can unmute themselves and holler if we're not seeing you. So, but we will save some time at the end for Q&A. All right. So CALGreen compliance, how do we demonstrate compliance? Usually there's a required, you should submit the checklist. A couple different ways that you can do that. We typically have an Excel spreadsheet that has the code language that's relevant, and then kind of a yes or no, and where it's being referenced and what the calculation is. So that's a strategy. And then we have kind of a Word document with our notes that are specific to that project. A lot of folks also use this kind of AIA sheet. It takes a whole sheet and a plan set. That's a fine approach also, but you can't just turn in the sheet like this, because that's just the code. So you got to make sure if you are using this sheet, or if you're on the intake side, that you're filling out the columns. So you're putting a yes or not applicable, and then the detail or sheet reference. So it's perfectly acceptable to use this, but you just got to make sure that you're actually making it customized for that project. All right, so let's go into our mandatory measures. There are 5 sections in here. As I said, it does happily follow LEED, if you're familiar with that. So we have planning and design, kind of all the site stuff. We have energy efficiency, then goes into water efficiency and conservation, materials and resources, and then environmental quality, which is really indoor environmental quality. As we go through each section, we've added a code reference up at the top corner, and where they're the same, we pair the residential and the non-residential, or we break them out if they're different. And then we add little notes where it's helpful for tips for documentation. Any questions so far on scope or where we're going? Okay, let's keep going. So here we are under the planning and design, site work, stormwater drainage and retention during construction. This is for specific to projects that are disturbing less than an acre, because anything more than an acre is going to bump into a different requirement or entity. So what we're trying to do is prevent the flooding, but also the any dust mitigation to adjacent properties, and prevent erosion. You can do it all kinds of different ways. Your civil engineer is typically the one who's going to have a plan with the strategies about where you put your wattles and your straw bales and silt fence and all of those types of things. And then you're also going to want to make sure that you have the best management practices for pollutants, potential pollutants. This is only spelled out in non-residential, but of course it's good practice anyway. To make sure that you're not doing vehicle oil changes or something that might spill, that you have a washout for your concrete, and have a staging area, and vehicle, keeping the dirt from rolling off the site. So, and then if you're greater than an acre or greater, then you fall into the National Pollution Discharge Elimination System, which is through the water board. And so for any of those things, just make sure that you have civil drawings that show those erosion, sedimentation, dust control plans, and any other notes that go with that. Grading and paving, we're just trying to keep the water off the building. All kinds of fun ways to do that with rain gardens and bioswales. At its most basic, you got to make sure that you're showing on the site plan that if you have the hardscape, that it's that they're sloping away from the building. So there's a lot of ways to keep the water out of your building. You could go to a dry well or a cistern, or just, depending on what you're trying to do, or even a rain garden with retention. Here we show, this is a rain garden. There's a rain chain here from one neighbor, and then this one's a downspout that goes to a perforated pipe. So we're capturing the stormwater on site. And again, this is the fun stuff. This is how we get to be able to support our aquifer. We end up with more landscape, space for critters, native and adapted species, just trying to, move away from the old model of water just running down the street or running, into our creeks too fast, so that then the creeks can't hold the water and it all goes out to the ocean. We certainly experienced that from the last big rainstorms. That we're just crying to have all the water rushed out to the ocean, instead of having ways to capture it and sink it, slow it, sink it, and then it can clean itself along the way through these plantings. All right, within bicycle parking. So it's not required for residential, it's only in the non-residential section. But again, of course, jurisdictions might have bike requirements that are above and beyond CALGreen. But in the non-res section, we have two types of bike parking: short-term for the visitors, and that's just kind of a regular bike rack. Personally, we really like Peak Rack. They're local in San Luis Obispo, and they have a really good system to be compact and lockable. So you have to have at least 2 bikes minimum, and then more as a percentage of the new vehicle parking spaces. So if you're doing an addition and alteration and you're not adding parking, you don't actually have to add the bike racks, but it's a good idea, and it should be visible and within 200 feet of the entrance. Within long-term bike parking, that's to be able to support employees who want to bike to work. And so you need something more secure. They're not going to want to leave their nice bike in in a bike rack for the whole day. So if you have 10 or more tenant occupants, so employees basically, or if you're adding a lot of parking, then you need to have 5% of the tenant vehicle parking, or a minimum of 1. To be able to have that parking convenient from the street. So, and then public schools have a slightly different ratio for that, to make sure that there's student parking and staff parking. So we're going to show the bike racks on the plans. You're going to have the calculation. You're going to have the details as specific. And then what does that actually look like? In terms of the visitor parking, we kind of know that route is pretty flexible, but long-term parking, it's actually pretty specific. It needs to be covered, lockable enclosure, permanently anchored racks. You could have a bike room inside of a building with permanently anchored racks. You can have bike lockers that are outside. So these are the types of things you can do here on the left, but here, this one's too hard to get on and it's open to everybody else. This one isn't anchored. It's not a great rack anyway, but it's also movable, so that would not count. Okay. And now we're going to get into electric vehicle charging. I'm going to turn this over to Soham, and let's see. I'm just checking to see if there's any other questions that have come in so far. Otherwise, we'll turn it over. Soham.
Awesome. Hello, everyone. So today we're going to be talking about some of the definitions and how we talk about electric vehicle charging. We're going to cover the way that charging approaches the different types of occupancies in single, multifamily, and non-res. There's this emerging world of medium and heavy duty charging, which we'll talk about for commercial projects. And finally, we'll address that parking lot scope and how it triggers some of the electric vehicle requirements here. So throughout the code, you'll see EV spaces referred to in 3 different ways. We have EV capable, EV ready, and an EV charging station. These are shorthands to describe sort of the quality and what's involved in the spaces. And as we can see sort of in the text here, an EV capable space is sort of where you have the infrastructure in place so that if one wants to make it an EV space, it's sort of ready for that. EV ready means you've provided the wiring and the conduit so that a person could use one of those over-the-counter cables to plug into that outlet and charge their car with. And then an EV charging station is maybe where there's a bit more infrastructure, and it's maybe what you've seen in non-residential applications like grocery stores or shopping malls, where you have the charger that plugs into the car. This is not quite a Tesla charger, but as we'll see in the next slide, there's different types of equipment that can go into these spaces. And that level 1, 120 volt is often what you'll see for that like EV ready, EV capable. The level 2 we're seeing here in the middle is that wall mounted higher voltage charger that charges those vehicles faster. And then this level 3 refers to those Tesla superchargers you might see scattered around, like for example, in the slow public market. These level 3 chargers are, as you can see, at a higher voltage, higher ampage. They're not what is currently required of the code, but you see them in a lot of spaces. Really what we're looking for when we talk about electric vehicle charging stations is that level 2. And at the level 1 is sort of the consumer or occupant choice if they have an electric vehicle to be able to charge. But that's sort of up to their prerogative to utilize.
Right. And I'll just chime in there in that if you do a level 3 charger that is broadly applicable to broadly usable by the masses, it can meet the level 2 requirement. But if you put in a Tesla, it won't meet the CALGreen because that's only for specific vehicles. We had a hotel where they ended up needing to do, they wanted to do the Tesla, but they still had to come in and do a regular level 2 charger for the rest of the folks.
Yeah, thank you. And so, as we mentioned, when we're talking about these EV spaces, as you notice, the 3 different types of spaces, capable, ready, and charging station, some of them are built out, some of them are not built out. So how do we label these spaces? If it's for a future EV space where a project isn't requiring you to actually install the full EV charging station, you want to label the breaker and the stub up, the place where sort of the rest of the infrastructure would come in, but you do not want to label actually with paint on the stall. So this is that when the work gets done to fully build out the charging space, they know where the breaker is, they know where the stub is. It's super clear. If you're doing a project where it's required to have the space be like EV ready or be an even EV charging station, you want to, again, still label the breaker so they know where the infrastructure is, but you also want to label the space very clearly so that people know, if it's not already obvious by the charging station, that this is for electric vehicle charging only. And so now getting into sort of the scopes. First off, with single family, we're not seeing a change here from the last code. With single family charging, you want the home to be EV capable. So that looks like what we're seeing on the image in the left, where there's the wiring in place, the conduit, and sort of the capability, so that if a homeowner chooses to, they can install what we're seeing on the right with an EV charging station. So again, you're required to sort of get the infrastructure there so that a homeowner can choose to do the work to install it. And it's currently not required for accessory dwelling units and junior accessory dwelling units.
And to be clear on this one, it's that first EV, where it's conduit only. You're not actually having to put in the wires. And there was an interesting discussion about this when they were developing this code section, that they didn't want to put in a whole bunch of copper at these houses when it may or may not get used. So they didn't want this stranded asset of actual wiring. So it's, make it easy, but not a stranded asset.
Thank you, Andy. Yeah. And then now as we head into the multifamily, the code makes a nuance between a project that has less than 20 dwelling units and one that has 20 or more. So when we're looking at a project with less than 20 dwelling units, what the code is asking us to do is that of the number of dwelling units, 10% of that number, we provide EV capable spaces, and 25% of that number, we provide EV ready spaces. And so in example calculation, if a project has 18 parking spaces, 2 of them, 10% of 18 is 1.8, round up to 2, are EV capable, and 5 of them are EV ready. I want to point out a nuance here in the math in that if the project has less than 20 dwelling units, whatever number of parking spaces you have is where you do the math. It's not on the number of dwelling units. So noting in this example, the project has 18, we're operating on the idea that there's under 20 dwelling units. There could be 6, there could be 8, that there's sort of a code requirement for parking spaces, but the math is done on the parking spaces. It's triggered by the number of dwelling units. And so that when we then look at 20 or more, we see that EV charging stations are introduced. And so again, we're seeing a similar 10% EV capable, which is where the conduit is there, 20% EV ready, where that, like all the wiring is done. And now 5% of total spaces have to be EV charging stations. And again, so that's that level 2 infrastructure with the wall mounted battery, what we're seeing here in this image. And so again, in an example, 80 parking spaces, 10% of 80 is 8 for EV capable, 25% is 20 for EV ready, and then 4 of them are EV charging spaces. And note that they're sort of cumulative, that we're not counting some of the EV capable for the EV ready. It's like 8, 20, and 4, and the rest are left as like non-altered, as traditional parking spaces. And then as we get to non-res, they're not working off the neat percentages, although they could be summarized. You're going to consult this table here. And I made the note about the math because when we're looking at this table, the EV charging stations count towards EV capable. So that sounds a bit confusing. So what that looks like is, again, if a project has 28 spaces, if we look towards the column for 28 spaces, where we see between 26 and 50, that's telling us that 8 of those spaces have to be EV capable, or 8 total EV spaces are required, my bad. 2 of them have to be EV charging stations, and therefore the other 6 are EV capable. That's different from our residential, where we might have seen 2 called out separately from 8. Here it's telling us first 8 spaces have to be EV spaces, and 2 of those spaces have to be charging stations. The rest have to be capable. So you just want to make sure you're reading the table a bit carefully and double checking your math when it comes to non-res, just because it's counted a bit differently from residential. And I saw a question in the chat here from Dee about accessibility and how these spaces have to address that. And what we're finding right now in the code is that all charging stations that are built for non-residential uses, as well as hotels, motels, and public housing, have to comply with the requirements we're already familiar with for accessible parking in terms of the dimensions. If you look into the building code, they've added certain sections more for the aisles, but pretty much we're seeing they match what we expect for the width of parking spaces for electric vehicle charging. But the count is slightly different that we'll see with electric vehicle charging, in that when we look at this table here, which is a separate table from your parking requirements, this is for electric vehicle charging stations for public and common use, which is that whole non-res projects and housing and hotel projects. What we see is the number of accessible EV charging spaces do not count towards the number of generally ADA accessible spaces on the project. So that's to say, when you're doing your parking calc and you find that you need, let's say, 1 or 2 parking spaces, they both cannot be EV spaces. You have to have accessible spaces that are not chargers. So that's what this clause is sort of for. So when we look at a project, when we look at the left column, we see the total number of charging spaces, and they'll tell us how many have to be van accessible, how much are standard accessible, how many are ambulatory. The number of EV van accessible spaces does not count towards the number of van accessible spaces. These are on top of the accessibility requirements in parking spaces that are already in the code.
Well explained. That's so hopefully everybody got that, but happy to answer the question. In terms of this diagram, this is a potential suggestion just to make sure that as you're going through that you can have a charger that's shared by 2 different parking stalls. But again, this is EV charging only, but they wouldn't count as your accessible requirements for the parking. So, but you can still have shared infrastructure as that goes.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you. And then this new thing we're seeing here about medium and heavy duty charging, that the phrase is maybe not quite clear what that refers to. This is because the state is sort of trying to accommodate for long range electric vehicles like electric trucks and electric shipping vehicles. And so sort of to get ready for that change, for all new construction for warehouses, grocery stores, and retail stores, what they're asking is that on the panels, we're adding capacity in terms of raceways, transformers, and on the panels, so that any off-street loading spaces that would be used for sort of taking all of the goods off a shipping truck could also become a charging facility for an electric hauling vehicle. And so you're not asked to sort of installing the charger yet. This is just to make sure that the panel and the infrastructure is ready, so that when the code asks for charging for long range or like electric hauling vehicles, that the facility is ready and is able to handle the additional load required from that change. And then last thing, there was the note when looking at chapter 3 about parking lots. And what that means is for projects under the jurisdiction of the Housing and Community Development, when parking facilities are added or electrical and lighting systems are added or altered, any of the spaces that are affected by the work, 10% of those spaces must be made EV ready. And so what that means is if you have a parking structure, maybe you're swapping out or you're improving some of the quality of the systems, or you're adding another, let's say, parking garage for community development, 10% of those spaces must be made EV ready for the project.
Right. And the logic here being if you're in there doing electrical work anyway, go ahead and do the upgrade while you're there.
Awesome. And so finally, in all of this scope of work, whether you're putting an EV ready, EV charging station, regardless, you want to show on the title sheet calculations for your count. So given how many parking spaces, how many of certain types of spaces in terms of EV charging would you need? And on the site plan and in the details, you want to label the different types of spaces. So when we see in these images here, we see EVCS ready or EV ready to refer to that quality of space. We also then see a clear labeling of the striping on the stall and the bottom plan where it says EV charging only. So that we're making it clear on the plans and making it clear through striping what the purpose of the spaces are. And that, as the last point says, that you label the panel space on the panel, but also on the electrical sheet, you're making a note of what is for electric vehicle infrastructure.
And this is just for folks who have been using CALGreen for a while, and we used to have designated parking. So it would say clean air, van pool, EV. I can't tell you how many variations we used to see on the parking spaces for this one, but now that whole section is gone because we have the emphasis directly on the EV charging. All right. Any questions on EV charging before we go on? Let's see, somebody, FYI, accessible EV spaces are not required to be used exclusively for disabled persons as are regular accessible parking spaces. Oh, sure, that makes sense. Thanks for that, that clarification. Appreciate that. So if it's not if it's a accessible space that if it's a charging station that happens to also work for vans, then anybody can still use that space. Good clarification. All right, so light pollution, we're trying to not have light shoot up above horizontal, and it's not helpful to have that uplighting for critters, for our neighbors, and it's a waste of energy. So really trying to keep our outdoor lighting at the light levels and light direction. So typically we've been using the backlight, uplight, glare, or bug rating methodology for that. Dark sky compliant is another way that we think about it, but it may or may not line up exactly. And other local jurisdictions may have stricter ordinances than that. So, and it depends on how far you are from the property line about which bug ratings are allowed, and if you're on a building mount or out in a parking lot, et cetera. It doesn't apply to emergency lighting, and it doesn't apply. There was two cycles ago, there was a lot of confusion because there was the energy code had an exception for the backlight uplight glare requirements, and CALGreen did not. And so we're having some frustrations there, trying to figure out which one was compliant. So now it says specifically if the energy code exempts it, CALGreen will also exempt it. So that's for luminaires with less than 62 lumens, initial luminaire lumens, which honestly, ends up taking out a lot of the focus on bug ratings, because a lot of luminaires are going to hit that mark. But if you are relying on the bug lighting, just make sure that on your exterior lighting schedule on electrical that you show the it'll say like B0, U1, G1 or something like that. So make sure that you show your bug ratings. Division of State Architects, they require shade trees. So again, jurisdictions might, but if you're working on a school or another DSA project, there are specifics about even the container size and the ratio of hardscape. So be sure to check on that. Okay, so that was the site. Now we go on to energy efficiency. Projects, residential, non-residential must comply. Whoop, code change, missed that one. With the 2022 Title 24 Part 6 and any local reach codes. And for CALGreen, that's it. There's really nothing else in that section until you get to tiers. Okay, so water efficiency and conservation. Plumbing fixtures. We don't really have any new changes to this, but there were mid-cycle changes last time, so not everybody has caught up in the requirements. So we see that in just a couple of areas. This has been around for a long time, but in residential bathrooms, the max is 1.2. We're pretty good at that, but there's also a minimum for residential lavatories of 0.8 gallons per minute. So if you're used to using public bathrooms of 0.5 or even a 0.35, those don't work for a residential setting. And then kitchen faucets are 1.8, and the others we don't use a whole lot. Within the plumbing fixtures, they need to be WaterSense certified, which is most toilets are, but not all. And 1.28 gallons per flush is the max. Now we have 1.1 are available, even 0.8. So there are lower flows available. And then urinals, this was one of those mid-cycle changes to 1/8 of a gallon per flush. Again, pretty standard, easy. Folks have adapted to that pretty well. And then dual flush, if you're doing a low and a high, as long as the weighted average comes out to that 1.28 or lower, you can still use the dual flush option with a low and a heavy flow. Shower heads also need to be WaterSense certified, less than 1.8 gallons per minute. And if you're doing the multiple shower head thing, the total combined flow at any time is 1.8 gallons per minute. So what that means is you can't do a shower where one person can get 2 shower heads at the same time, or 3, with the up above. That's not allowed. You can have a big shower that has 2 different heads, so 2 people can use it at the same time, but then you can't, they need to be far enough away that one person isn't getting both flows. So sorry, the shower, the waterfall shower experience not allowed. And then the water conserving fixtures, we also have the pre-rinse spray valve. That's actually been a requirement for flow under Title 20 for a while, but it didn't have it in CALGreen. And so now CALGreen has moved it into the mandatory measures so that we have a flow rate that aligns with other parts of the California code. So meters and sub-meters when are sub-meters required? So for non-residential projects, if you're doing a new building or an addition that's over 50,000 square feet, it triggers sub-meters, but only for uses that are over 100 gallons a day. That's pretty low, right? But anything, if you obviously don't have a water fixture in there or just a little hand sink, it probably wouldn't trigger this. But if it's got a break room and its own bathroom, or if it's a dentist's office or something that's going to have a fair amount of some water use, then you do need to sub-meter. If the project, the non-residential, is less than 50,000 square feet, you don't have to sub-meter unless you get to the point where it's excessive consumption. And then regardless of the building size, if you're using over 1,000 gallons a day, you do need a sub-meter. So that's maybe probably restaurants, obviously like laundromats, things like that. Gyms that have showers, those are the kinds of things that would trigger that excessive consumption. And then for multifamily, yes, every unit needs a sub-meter, but that's per the plumbing code. So CALGreen just references that. And then food waste disposers have, depending on the auto shut off and when it's being used, there are flow requirements on food waste disposers. For outdoor landscaping, we point to the MWELO or MWELO, the Model Water Efficient Landscape Ordinance. That's for residential projects that are over 500 square feet and all non-res developments. And this is, a calculation. You can do these calculations yourself in terms of irrigation efficiency and the plant factor, and then you figure out what your actual use is going to be, your modeled allowable water allowance, and then and you compare the two, what your proposed is compared to what's allowed. And then there's a couple of special uses in terms of public schools and community colleges, and health facilities must comply with this as well. In the prior code cycle, there was a section that said if there's municipal recycled water available, that on residential, you probably have to use it. On non-res, you definitely have to. And in this cycle, they took it out. There were, it was problematic that it wasn't helpful. So, so they took that section out altogether, and now it's kind of reserved, and maybe something else will come out in the future. I think it just depends, because there's not always availability, and it's really up to a jurisdiction if they're going to be providing purple pipe water, that it's up to them to figure out who can use it or not. All right, so that was the water section. Any questions on that for before we go on? Let's see. Niagara, the Stealth, it's a great affordable at 0.8 gallons per flush. Julie Clayton chimes in. I agree. I love those things. They're really terrific device. Okay, let's keep going into materials. So we're required to, by the Energy Commission, to seal all penetrations, but CALGreen goes a step further and says how you seal them so that they'll actually endure. Because if you just do like a foam around a pipe, it'll just get chewed up, and then you got rodents in your walls, and just not a good one. So you have to use a cement mortar, concrete, or metal. But you have to use something other than foam in order to make sure that these are going to hold up against critters. Some of these start to get very intuitive, so I won't spend a bunch of time on them, but weather resistant exterior wall and foundation. So that's CBC as well, but we're really trying to keep our surfaces dry. And so one of the ones that they call out is that irrigation systems not spray buildings. You show this on your plans with your irrigation. Typically, we're using so much more drip irrigation anyway, but as you can see, there are plenty of instances where you're just spraying a building and then you're getting the rot on the inside as far as that goes. Exterior openings, this is in the non-residential sections that all exterior entries have to have flashing, of course, with a drainage plane. But if they're primary doors, so could be just the front door, but if you have a back employee entrance or something like that, something that's getting open and closed quite a bit, you want to make sure, one, that you don't have absorbent flooring within 2 feet around the opening. So you can't have carpet, or if you do have carpet, you have to have a big enough walk-off mat in those first couple of feet. And then you have to have an overhang or a door recess of 4 feet. Again, that's one that gets missed a fair amount. It's just a good practice, but you do have to plan ahead a little and get those awnings or a recess. For LEED certification, those walk-off mats have to be 10 feet. That's how much they figure that if you really, because it's a global setting, but if you have snow in particular, but even if it's just wet, it takes several paces before the moisture comes off. Okay, getting into construction waste. This is residential and non-residential, required to recycle or salvage 65% of construction waste. That excludes the hazardous waste and as well soil and land clearing debris. If you have any, tree stumps, those automatically have to go to green waste. CALGreen requires a waste management plan, statement of results. There's in the last code cycle, they added an option for reduced generation. So if you're just super careful about not generating much waste in the first place, you don't have to hold to that diversion percentage. I've looked at this a couple of times on projects. It's really low. So yeah, so you have to be, it has to be just a really specific fit. And you can do it a couple ways, right? In terms of the source separation, you can separate on site, and then each of those bins gets recycled 100% directly, and then you have a waste. Or you can rely on your hauling, wherever you're hauling everything to sort the mix C&D and then give you a report of the waste diversion.
And Andy,
Yeah.
Before we get too far away from the overhang topic, Julie had a question in the chat that the 4-foot overhang, is that also for single family residents?
Not in CALGreen. Good question, though. It seems like that's kind of a good practice. And I don't know if that's required somewhere else in under the building standards. We'll look into that one. Question, Julie. Okay, thank you. So in the construction waste, the universal waste is not a term that I was familiar with, but it's basically household hazardous waste is the way that I know it more of. And it's basically, if you are doing an addition or alteration, you must figure out a way to recycle fluorescent lamps, mercury containing thermostats, if there's batteries, any of that stuff has to be diverted from the waste stream. And then of course, the vegetation, land clearing, everything must be reused or recycled or mulched or something like that. And so in terms of your documentation, we usually just kind of add the notes to the plans to the builder. So, hey, builder, here's the requirements for universal waste if it's a addition or alteration, and here's where to go to work with your jurisdiction on getting the construction waste management plan, etc. Also under the materials and resources is operations and maintenance manual, and this has it's tucked in there because this and commissioning has to do with kind of the long-term durability and performance of a building. So we're not that they're operating in a way that is also going to not be wasteful of an entire building not operating. So for residential construction, there's a homeowner manual, and it has 10 subjects. I think it's actually up to 12 about like, how do you maintain a home? Like, when do you clear your gutters? What's, specific about this one? How do we, what's the maintenance for changing filters? But also like, how do you access recycling at this property? How do you, I think transit, what solar incentives are available? I mean, there's just kind of all these layers in this homeowner's manual. I haven't seen a lot of jurisdictions asking for it, honestly. So it's one of those, I think that if we can kind of get more into the habit of providing it as a standard, that we'll be able to have some good information. It can be online, so we're also seeing like tract housing developments that they'll provide an online cloud-based manual. And for non-residential also to just for maintenance staff to be able to understand it. And so, yes, we've developed a template, we could provide it to the builders, and then they can fill in like, here's the dishwasher instructions, and put it all together, and then the homeowner gets this manual. For non-res, the operations and maintenance should come out of the commissioning process. So, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. You are required under CALGreen to have recycling for occupants. Again, makes a lot of sense. A certain amount of floor area or space for bins. And then increasingly is the recycling of organics. And so, and just now as of January 1st of this year, not as part of CALGreen, but just as part of AB 1383, SB 1383, that requires everybody to collect organic food waste. And so as you're doing a design, on the design side, just make sure you're allowing enough space, not just for trash and recycling, but also for organic. All right, so in terms of commissioning, so commissioning is a process for non-residential projects. The full commissioning is required for projects over 10,000 square feet. So that's mostly where we've seen it, but there are requirements for all non-residential buildings. And it's basically this, like we call it the circle of accountability, where you start with the owner, like what does the owner want as a document? That's the owner project requirements, OPR. Then there's the design team figuring out how to meet the owner requirements. That's the basis of design, the BOD. Then it goes to, there's the design review to make sure that we're incorporating the OPR and BOD into the actual plan set. The commissioning plan, we have a commissioning authority who's developing the plan, so how those systems will be checked to make sure that we're meeting all those pieces. Then we actually have the performance tests, so we're verifying the performance per the design, and then we circle all the way back. Does the building perform the way the owner wanted it to per the OPR, right? So this whole circle that feeds on itself, builds on itself to make sure that we're getting whatever it is, the temperature controls, the light levels, the ventilation requirements, etc. So for these new buildings, each of these has a specific requirement in both CALGreen and the energy code, and those first four are required as part of your permit application, and then the next happens during this construction. We actually have as part of this 3C Ren series, we have a class coming up, and we'll show you the schedule at the end, but focuses on commissioning and field verification requirements under the energy code, but it will also overlap with this CALGreen requirement. There's a form, again, that's on the energy code side that has us checking off all the boxes and making sure that we have the thing performing. And so here's just a few highlights to make sure that it's required for Title 24, Part 6 as well. And the design review is required for all projects, even if they're smaller than 10,000 square foot. And CALGreen, just to make things confusing, adds irrigation and PVs to the scope where the energy code does not. So almost the same, but you still have to look at both. All right, for buildings under 10,000 square feet, CALGreen does call for testing and adjusting. So hopefully your MEP folks will develop the testing plan, and you'll be able to follow through in terms of what the procedure is, manufacturer spec, of course, the balancing, testing and adjusting, balancing the tab, and the report that the inspector will look for. So that is materials and resources. I'll pause. Let's see. So is there a basic template for the O&M manual currently available? There is an outline in CALGreen that has each of the sections that are required. I haven't checked lately to see if in the appendices they have an actual manual. No, someone's nodding their head. So no on a template that we've seen. There are templates though for other, like the commissioning has a lot of forms in there, how to do the water calculations are in the appendices, but otherwise not an actual template for the O&M through the California code. Okay, so now we're going into always a good question. I appreciate these. Okay, so now we're going into indoor air quality, fireplaces, a direct vent sealed, combustion type, meet the energy code, local ordinances, right? So basically you can't have an open wood burning something. You can have a wood burning fireplace per CALGreen. It just needs to be a sealed glass and have a direct vent. For temporary ventilation, if you are using an HVAC system during construction, you have to have a MERV 8 at least as a return air filter, because they don't want you trashing the permanently installed HVAC system during construction. And then prior to occupancy, you change it out to whatever is required, which is 13 minimum, but might be higher based on the design of the building. And so MERV, if you're not familiar with that, it refers to kind of how much filtration is in there, and it's basically a thickness of these filter types. You need to cover duct openings. So once you've installed the ducts, they should actually arrive on site with the ends capped or covered in some way to stay airtight. If you're installing for the day, you open them up, connect them, and then once they're installed, you cover the ends again. None of these down below are decent ways to cover a duct opening, because the dust will get in there. And then once there's dust in there, if the moisture gets in, then the dust and the moisture is food, right? So then we get dangerous conditions for air quality. So and we've had to do this sometimes for whatever reason, the ducts, either the little caps at the end have torn and dust got in, and then you don't have to tear them out, but you do have to clean them. So require the contractor to clean them because dust and moisture bad. All right, and now we go into pollutant control, and so I'll chime in for this.
Thanks, Andy. So in this portion, we're going to be talking about the different types of materials that are under, that have some sort of requirements when it comes to pollution control, often called low emitting materials. These are materials that we want to show they're compliant with minimal off-gassing or low sort of toxic chemicals that come associated with the product. And in your documentation, you're usually wanting to show the tables of what's required for the products, and then the ability to verify is required. So knowing how these different materials are compliant, and we're going to talk about what those materials are and how to show that they are compliant. And so the first type of compliant or sort of restrictions we'll see set are with tables. And so throughout the CALGreen code, there are a few different tables that are referenced for different types of materials. And so these are for adhesives, sealants, and caulks, carpet adhesive, paints and coatings, and composite wood products. And usually when you're looking at these products, you'll see on the product, as you see on the top right for that caulking product, it'll say if it meets some sort of state code or some sort of minimum. And then you would want to reference that to the table in CALGreen seen below to make sure the product is compliant with what's required. And so in this case, you're looking for some sort of reported number on the product or in a cut sheet, and you're comparing it to the table in CALGreen. And so for these 4 types of materials, that's often the way you can be assured that the product you're using is compliant with CALGreen. Another sort of pathway for showing compliance is the product being compliant with a certificate program. And so products that are most often found through this method are carpets, resilient flooring materials, and composite woods. And so when you're looking at this product, usually on their product sheet or in their branding and marketing, they'll kind of brag about having one of these labels. For example, Floor Score is a pretty common one. UL Green Guard is another one we see often for a lot of different types of products. As you see here, it's applicable for all 3 types here. And so in this case, in the code, it'll mention either compliant with like some sort of number or a certificate program. And so this sort of cuts the step of checking the actual numbers. This just tells you it's compliant with the code. And so in the previous code cycle, carpet, resilient flooring, and composite woods were some of these products. But in the new code cycle, we actually see a few more materials added. And so new for 2022, we see insulation, ceiling tiles, and wall panels have been added. And again, all these products in CALGreen have a table that tells you like how much of a certain chemical is allowed to be in there. But these materials have certificate programs that they can apply for to show that compliance really quickly without having to look for that number. And so when you're looking for insulation, ceiling tiles, or wall panels that are compliant, you want to look for these labels that you're seeing beneath the respective products.
And then going on, the pollutant control, we have these filters that we mentioned need to be at least MERV 13, needs to be on the filter and labeled. And, you know, I think, again, folks are used to this. This was came in the last code cycle that we're pretty excited about in terms of indoor air quality, but it's, you know, it's a bigger draw for energy. So just coordinating with mechanical engineers to make sure. Of course, no smoking, but you actually do also have to label for the if they're smoking, what the smoking restriction is. So no smoking indoors, we all know that, but in terms of outdoors, it needs to be prohibited 25 feet of the building entries, outdoor intakes, operable windows, and of course in the buildings. And so there's a few different ways to do that depending on the project. Sometimes this is a no smoking site, no smoking on premises. If you have a relatively small site, you can do that. You can have a sign. This one's not quite right. I think it makes me laugh a little bit. No smoking within 25 feet of entrances and exits. Often the same thing, but that's okay. And operable windows. But maybe they don't have air intakes that are at ground level. So maybe that one works. So you do have to post a sign, though. That's part of CALGreen. Within the slabs, in terms of foundation, the concrete slabs have to have a vapor retarder. This kind of aligns again with just good building practices in the CVC, but the point here is that you have to have a capillary break, and we're trying to do this is under indoor air quality because we're trying to prevent moisture intrusion into our buildings, which then can lead to mold and health issues. So there's some details here in terms of what that capillary break might be looking like. Not my expertise. I'm not going to pretend that I would be able to answer a construction detail on this one, but do make sure that that you get this one detailed. And of course, a vapor barrier. So here's one that doesn't have a vapor barrier or a vapor retarder or a capillary break. Here's a Superstar that has all of the vapor retarder and a capillary break. then for like passive house and really good ceiling, you want to make sure all your seams are taped, etc. Moisture content of buildings, building materials. So one of these little moisture meters are really helpful in the rainy season, or even just getting wood delivered on site, because it has like a tiny little point and you put it into the wood and it tells you the moisture content. And if it exceeds 19%, you can't enclose the building. So sometimes building inspectors will have that in their back pocket and just be going around checking it. So good to note yourself. 3 random floor wall moisture tests are required. Again, may or may not be needed depending on the time of year. And if you have water damage, like, disaster, right? Don't install that. Happily, wood does dry out, so it's not that it's wasted. Like a drywall might get ruined, but wood will dry out. Bathroom exhaust fans for residential exhaust must be ducted to the exterior. It has to be Energy Star certified. And unless you can capture that through a whole house ventilation, like a what do we call the little ducted, I'm forgetting the name, but anyway, if you have a system with an HRV and little ducts that are all over the place, you can install a system, but you still need to have it controlled by a humidistat. So make sure that your bathroom ventilation complies. And then for your heating and air conditioning systems, if you are doing a ducted system, you do need to have an ACA calculation that shows what they were finding is that kind of rule of thumb for HVAC design wasn't reflective of today's Title 24 compliant buildings. And so they were oversizing the systems, oversizing the ductwork, and it was a waste of energy and the buildings weren't performing as well. So you do have to either have a licensed engineer design the building, or if you're not doing that, then you do need to provide calculations per the ACA manual J, B, and S, or ASHRAE for the engineers. So make sure you're checking for those in terms of your documentation. And then just, again, trying to hit that sweet spot on not too moist, not too dry, optimum zone for moisture protection. So it's referring back to the California, the building code. Indoor air quality under non-residential, that you do have carbon dioxide monitoring requirements. And then acoustic control, we'll spend just a moment on this because, again, I think initially acoustics wasn't really thought of as green building, but it was added when they were finding that a lot of green buildings were had occupant concerns because of noise levels. And so either from outside noise or from each other. So in terms of the acoustic control, we have the sound transmission class, the STC is how we're determining the isolation. And then there's the outdoor-indoor sound transmission class is the alternative approach. And so these are some strategies for isolation, a double stud wall, right? So that they're actually totally decoupled between tenant spaces, having good windows that air seal. This is an exterior insulation product. So it could help with thermal performance, but also acoustic performance because it's a continuous exterior insulation on the outside of studs, especially if you're doing metal studs, those transmit sound really easily. And so what triggers that? So if you are near an airport or freeway, trains, and you can go to like a jurisdiction has a noise element, would be a way to do it, and you find out if you're within the 65 CNEL noise contour. I meant to relook up the, sorry, I can't remember the noise elevation, what that acronym stands for, but there's the legend there. And if you're within that, your project, your walls and roof have to have an STC rating of 50, and your windows have to have an STC rating of 40, or if you're using the OITC rating of 30. So, so again, that's something we've had a couple of projects where that wasn't on their radar initially, and so they had to add it in. And then for interior noise, multi-tenant spaces require a minimum STC of 40 for the wall and or wall floor ceiling assemblies, separating the tenant spaces and separating tenant spaces and public spaces. So if you're building this wall here, then it's going to be required to be at least an STC 40. Okay. And then just, you know, noise exposure where noise contours aren't easily available. There's more information in the code, and they allow performance methods. So if you have an acoustic engineer on board, they can certainly come up with their own plan for isolation. It just needs to meet that equivalency. So, okay. Let's see. So ozone depletion. These were for CFCs. I won't spend a lot of time on this, but our mechanical engineers need to, you know, make sure we're on board. Halons in terms of fire suppression equipment, no halons. Added at the last cycle was supermarket refrigerant leak reduction. So if you're working on supermarkets, make sure you check out that section. And that's the mandatory measures. We'll spend just a few minutes on the appendices for the tiers and how they work, but we won't go into the specifics. So again, this was developed in a way for jurisdictions typically that would want to require a higher level. So County of San Luis Obispo required tier 1, for example. Again, I'm not seeing a whole lot of use for this in terms of a whole tier, but we are seeing it as a mitigation measure where it might be a strategy that the jurisdiction will require tier 1 for energy performance, or tier 1 for waste diversion as a way to mitigate environmental concerns. So, and those are within those electives. But if you're doing the whole tier system, within each section, there's required mandatory measures that are a little bit higher. So like under planning and design, a new requirement might be additional EV charging stations. So you have to do that, and then you pick any 2 electives. And then tier 2 is like that, planning and design, 4 prerequisites, and then 4 electives. So it goes through like that within each section that are either mandatory plus electives and general electives on that. So this is the residential one, non-residential, similar, and then you have to have kind of one more bonus one. So like I say, County of San Luis Obispo still requires for projects over 10,000 square feet to do a tier 1, but they don't, tier 1 has a mandatory better than Title 24 by 10%. And so county does not require that, but they require the rest of it. Interestingly, is a lot of times we'll see those mandatory measures, we'll see the voluntary measures hang out in tier 1 or tier 2 for one cycle, and then they'll scooch over to the mandatory measures for the next cycle. For example, we are anticipating in a mid-year, middle of 2024, an update on low carbon concrete. So that's currently an elective under tier 1, and it could become a mandatory measure for very large buildings that would have a lot of concrete. So exciting ways to address embodied carbon. And so with that, we'll take questions. And in general, if you have questions about Title 24, Part 6, Energy Code, or Part 11 for CALGreen, The Energy Code Coach is a totally free service. Imbalance Green Consulting is proud to be a provider for that service. So if you fill out the form online, you're going to end up reaching our team, and we'll be able to answer your questions directly and pull from other experts in the field. So that's for designers, builders, plans examiners, inspectors, engineers, contractors, subcontractors, etc. Let's see, and maybe before we do questions, Sarah, do you want to do kind of the wrap up so folks know, and then I'll stop screen sharing?
Yeah, definitely. So just in closing, for continuing education units, feel free to email me if you need to provide your numbers for AIA or ICC. I will submit those learning units for you after the class, and I get attendance. And coming to your inbox will be the slides, recording, and we have a survey. The survey just really helps us out to gauge interest and helps determine future courses. With that, I also will just go ahead and launch a poll. That way we can kind of gauge some of that knowledge of the course and everything just ahead of time. As far as for courses coming up, I did neglect to add the acceptance testing and commissioning course to this list. So I'll go ahead and add it to the chat, and I'll update the slides too, just so that it is in there for everyone. But we have a really busy calendar. There's lots of great courses coming up. Many of them are from Imbalance Green Consulting. So we hope to see you all in a future course. And yeah, with that, I think we'll just open it up for questions. We did have one that came through earlier. Just if there were any suggestions for manufacturers for prefab long-term bike storage solutions.
That is a great question. I don't have a preferred manufacturer. Honestly, I see kind of a mix of people using indoor rooms as much as the bike walkers, interestingly, or some other kind of in the field type of solution. So yeah, I don't have a recommended manufacturer. If anybody else does, now's a fine time to chime in on. I always think of this as more an opportunity for information exchange. So if anybody has a preferred manufacturer for bike walkers, feel free to unmute or type it into the chat. I also want to say on the, it'll show up on that course offerings, but for anyone who's a licensed architect and looking to get their 5 hours of zero net carbon design required by the state of California. So you have to have 5 units of accessibility continuing education, and new this year, 5 units of zero net carbon design. We've offered an in-person course for AIA San Luis Obispo and AIA Santa Barbara, and now we're offering it online. So each session is an hour, and they're spaced every few weeks over the spring and summer. So if you're interested in learning more about zero net carbon design or want to get those learning units, that's a good one to keep an eye out. Any other questions, comments, opinions about CALGreen? All right.
It looks like one did come through the chat. Let's see. Do you see the 10% RCV measure in Tier 1 being difficult for projects to achieve? Looks like Jenna has a multifamily project and it's barely reaching 4% for a high-rise residential with GPR Platinum and recycled content materials.
So Jenna, maybe do you want to unmute and kind of talk a little bit about what you have going on and where you where it's struggling? I assume we're talking about a reduced carbon requirement of tier 1?
Sure, this is the total recycled content value. So there's either by cost, by weight, which I don't really understand how to quantify for a large project like this.
Oh,
we went with
sorry, yes.
cost, and there's recycled content, insulation, flooring. There's a list of materials, but when it comes down to like the total percentage of all materials used,
Yeah.
cost of the project, it's really difficult to achieve that one. And I have a couple other projects coming up, so I'm curious if there's any tips on.
Right. So super interesting. So recycled content as a percentage of the value of the project. Again, this was a lead strategy. So recycled content, regional materials. And the idea here is that you you selectively specify materials that have a high recycled content, and that helps to drive the market, right, to be able to procure that waste that everybody's recycling, but then what do you do with it, right? So we're putting it into carpets, et cetera. Traditionally, steel is really high recycled content. So rebar is like almost always over 90% recycled content.
We're not allowed to use structural materials in the calculation. That's the difference.
Right. So that's so no structural. And honestly, we're trying to, for a low carbon building, we're moving away from a lot of concrete and steel. So we're trying to use more wood that may or may not have recycled content, not usually, right? So materials that have high recycled content are often carpet, drywall has a certain amount, acoustic ceilings, those types of things. I would say, depending on where the requirement for that piece is coming from. One is, last I looked, that the calculation didn't include mechanical equipment, right? I mean, it's only the value of those finished materials, but not mechanical equipment, right, Jenna?
Right.
As you're doing your calculation, because that wasn't clear in the initial one. And I remembered that I showed the jurisdiction that I showed them the calculations utilizing the lead calculation process. So that was one way to make sure that it was fair, because it didn't say specifically exclude mechanical elevators, things that are disproportionately huge in how much they cost and really hard to get any recycled content at all. So anyway, so that's kind of one piece, like what's our total valuation? And then the second piece is potentially talking to the jurisdiction and what that requirement is. If you demonstrate good faith and show like, look, these things aren't available, there tends to be a certain flexibility, I have found. And again, especially if you're using wood, not steel, or, kinds of panel products.
Mhm.
Hopefully, does that help at all?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's just good to hear somebody's voice behind the measure because it's a lot to digest.
It's like,
From
where's this
manuals
coming
and
from?
booklets and all that. But yeah, we've gone into the city for an exemption, and
Yeah.
we'll see how that goes. Thank
Yeah, good. All right. Well, if you feel free to use the code coach too. That sometimes is a resource for when a plans examiner and a design team aren't necessarily seeing eye to eye. Sometimes having the code coach come out and weigh in one way or the other. Like we've done that for like, what's the timing? What are the real requirements for commissioning for a phased project? And it's not like one's right or wrong, but just like what's a reasonable application and what's typically being done, that type of thing. So good discussion. I appreciate that. All right. Anybody else? Otherwise, we'll hang on the line here for a few minutes if anybody's feeling shy, but otherwise we'll give you a few minutes of your life back. And everyone, thanks so much for coming. Appreciate it. Have a good one. Hey, Mary White, I see you.
Hi, how are you?
Well, how are you?
Good, good. I'm really appreciating these courses and I'm going to have to go back and rewatch them.
It's hard to absorb all at once, but I noticed that Sarah, somebody asked and Sarah was able to provide the PDF along the way. Thought that was a pretty nice thing to do. So
Yeah. That one project I mentioned where there's little things that I have to tweak before you get those drawings.
yeah, not a problem. I was going to give you a little bit of time before I followed up with you.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely. Long-term bike storage solutions. Yeah. Wonder.
Thank you so much. I'm going to head out.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Mary. See you.
Appreciate it.
I haven't seen anybody weigh in about the bike storage solutions. I know that some municipalities are going towards bike rental, and there's an app where you can find them. Do you see those, Soham? Did those ever pop up where you can reserve them near transit?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen them in like big cities. I think like muni bikes. Like, are they similar in structure to those?
Yeah, but they're just the locker itself, not the bike rental. It's just like a locker to put your own personal one, but then you can, code it and yeah.
No, I haven't heard of that.
I think, yeah, kind of an interesting model. And there's just a whole weird security thing that happens. But anyway, for a private development, they have quite a few bike storage solutions. I'm gonna ask my my bike rabid bike for fans about that. Get some bike storage ideas. John Worthy. Okay. All right. I'm not seeing any other questions or comments coming up. Ready to close up, Sarah?
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us today, and the slides and recording will be sent out to you soon.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. Bye.
Bye.